I don't know. No.
Okay, it's on already.
Good evening. Welcome to our weekly class, Nitzutzos, Sparks of the Parsha, tidbits of Torah knowledge, little bits and pieces of Torah insights in different parts of the weekly Parsha. This week is really a very special week for many reasons. Number one, it's the Shabbos right after Tisha B'Av, the Shabbos of consolation as it's called, because this is the process of healing after we observed the events that led to and included the destruction of the temple. We have 7 weeks of consolation up until Rosh Hashanah, and every week there's another selection from the prophets that talk about how God comforts us. And this week we read the section of the prophet that says, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. My nation be comforted, double consolation. So this is called Shabbos Parshas Nachamu. If we have time, we'll go back to that a little bit later. The name of the Parsha, Voeschanan, is also very powerful. Moses pleads, imploring, beseeching, begging God to let him into the land of Israel. One of the most poignant stories in the Torah, where our greatest hero, if we can even use that term, the most holy, the most important leader of all of history up until Mashiach, cannot get his way. All he had was one request, to go into the land of Israel, and even that request was denied. And Moses prays, as the word Voeschanan translates as I have prayed, but it's more than just prayer, it's pleading, imploring. It's also interesting that the word Voeschanan numerically, because every word in Hebrew is also a numerical value that corresponds to other words that give you some insight. It is the same numerical value as the word tefillah, prayer, or shira, song. So these are all intertwined words and ideas. But Voeschanan is more than just prayer, because prayer is also request. But there are 2 types of requests. It's when you say, please, can I have this? And it's when you start begging and pleading, and that's what Moshe was doing. Our sages also tell us that the word Voeschanan, numerically, as I mentioned before, adds up to 515. And that was the number of prayers that Moses prayed, 515 times. And he didn't get his way. But that's only on the surface. There's no such thing as a prayer that doesn't work. Every prayer produces results. Sometimes the results are immediate, sometimes they're delayed, sometimes we never even see them because they happen way beyond our time. But every prayer is answered on one level or another. Moses' prayer to go over into the promised land was accepted by God, just not at that moment. It would happen, and it will happen in the Messianic age. The Midrash tells us Moses will arise, and he will take his people that he led in the desert, who perished in the desert. They will all come back to life, and he will lead them into the promised land. But Moses did get even a little bit of what he asked for just then and there. He said, I want to see the land. So God says, okay, you could see it. You watch it on Facebook. No, that's not exactly what happened. God told him, go up on the mountain and you'll see the land. And it's an interesting thing that Moses saw the atmosphere of Israel, the air of Israel. Anything that Moses did left an indelible mark on that which he touched. And if his eyes gazed on the land of Israel, it instilled holiness in the land to this day. That's why the Talmud says, Avira de Eretz Yisrael machkim. The air of Israel makes you smart. That's why Israel is so producing so many brilliant people in all areas of knowledge. It's just the air of Israel itself is permeated with Moses' vision. And the Talmud says that anything Moses touched could not be destroyed. He built the Mishkan, the tabernacle. The tabernacle was not destroyed. It was dismantled, and it was buried underneath the Temple Mount. It's still there as we see the Temple Mount, the wall, the western wall is there. Well, the Mishkan is also there, buried somewhere deeply under the ground. So anything Moses touched lasts forever. Well, if he looked into the land of Israel, that power that he vested into Israel is there to this day. You can feel it. If you're sensitive enough, you can feel it. So Moses pleads with God, and God tells him, no, you can see the land, but you won't go there. That's how the Parsha begins, and the Parsha continues with admonitions to the Jewish people. Moses is telling him, those people, this is in chapter 4, verse 4, those people who cleave to God are alive today. In other words, anything that's connected to God is alive. Anything that's not connected is not alive, even when it's there, because the true meaning of life is something that is permanent. If a person wants immortality, they have to connect to something that is immortal. Because our lives, by definition, are finite. One of the early commentators, known as Rabbeinu Bachaya, says, from the moment we're born, we already start to die. Death sets into our physical, biological system the very moment we begin our lives. But if we connect to something immortal, which is God, and God's teachings in the Torah, then that connects us to eternal life. We are alive forever. The Or HaChaim, one of the great Sephardic commentators, says an interesting thing, that there's a law that if God's name is written on a piece of paper, you're not allowed to erase it. You're not allowed to cross it out. You'd see this when the Rebbe would edit text and it had God's name, even in English, and somehow grammatically it didn't fit into the text and the Rebbe wanted to edit out. He wouldn't put a line through it as he would do for any other word that had to be edited out. He would draw a circle around it and indicate that it should be deleted, not a line through it, not erasing it, because the Torah says you're not allowed to do anything destructive to that which is godly. You can't destroy a synagogue, you can't destroy the temple, of course, in Jerusalem. You can't destroy anything that has God's name on it, which is one of the reasons that we are careful when we write God's name on a piece of paper that you know is not going to be preserved. We write G-D, because even though it's in English, it still represents God, and we don't want it to be somehow debased by throwing it into the garbage. So we don't write God's name out completely. That's the reason for that custom. So the Talmud says that if you write God's name, and it also has a prefix, let's say in Hebrew, the word to is le, and it's part of the same word. If you have a word to God, the to, the prefix, is not holy, because it's not God, that God's name wasn't mentioned. But if you have a suffix, like our God in Hebrew has the suffix after the word, Elokeinu, because it's attached to God's name, cross it out. Even though the word nu, the suffix nu, means ours, it's not a holy word, but because it's attached to God's name, it acquires the status of holiness of God's name. And just can't cross out God's name, can't cross out the suffix. In an article that I once wrote, and the Rebbe edited for a women's magazine called The Jewish Home, the Rebbe had a custom that he would edit the English as well as the content of that magazine, because he felt that educational material for women was very, very important, because that was being neglected. And it was interesting how I noticed that he put a line through every word he wanted to cross out, but there was one place where I had the word God apostrophe S, and the Rebbe changed the syntax of the sentence, and the apostrophe S was no longer needed. But he didn't cross it out, he put a circle around it. Even though it was not God, it was just the apostrophe S, because it was attached to God's name. So the Or HaChaim, the famous Sephardic commentator, says that's what it means. Just like if you attach something to God's name, even though it's not God's name, it's a suffix, it's possessive, it's plural, it becomes holy, it becomes godly. The same thing is true when we attach ourselves to God. Even though we're human, we're finite, we acquire this godly life that gives us immortality. Then later on, there's a lot in this Parsha. One of the things that makes this Parsha very special is that it contains two of the most important texts of Judaism. It has the 10 Commandments, really 10 statements, but we'll use the term 10 Commandments because that's the colloquial expression. And we have the Shema, the declaration of belief in the unity of God. So here are some very, very powerful things that relate to the 10 Commandments and the Shema. But before that, there's one other commandment that's also fundamental that's in this Parsha, where the Torah tells us we're not allowed to add on to the commandments, and we're not allowed to subtract. Lo tosifu, v'lo sigru. Don't add and don't subtract. Now the question is asked, okay, we can understand why we're not supposed to subtract. If God gave us a commandment, and He intends for us to observe it, we can't say, no, I don't want to do that anymore. It's outdated. That we can understand. Adding. What's wrong with adding another commandment? Well, to answer that question, there's a famous parable given by the Dubna Maggid. Dubna Maggid was a rabbi who lived about 250 years ago, and he was known for his parables. He was an incredible genius when it came to parables. So he once gave the following parable. A new guy moves into town, moves next door to someone who owned a house, and he knocks on the door and he says, oh, I'm new in town, and I'm trying to put my things together, and I need to borrow a spoon, a silver spoon. So could you lend me a silver spoon? Of course, being a good neighbor, he takes out a silver spoon and lends it to the newcomer. The next day, the newcomer comes back, returns the spoon with another little silver spoon. So the man says, what's that? I didn't give you that one. He says, oh, the spoon had a baby. So the silver spoon gave birth to the little one, and since it's the mother is yours, well, the child is also yours. The neighbor thinks this guy's a little strange, a little bizarre, but who's going to argue? A week later he comes, he says, can I borrow a silver platter? Yeah, sure. Next day he comes back with the silver platter with a smaller silver platter. And what's that all about? Well, the silver platter gave birth to a little platter. Who's going to complain? A week later he comes in and he says, you have a beautiful candelabrum, ornate, very, very precious. Can I borrow it for a banquet I'm having in my house? Sure, I'll be my guest. And that candelabrum is worth more than all the silver in the house. A day goes by, he doesn't return it. A week goes by, a month goes by. Finally, he goes to his neighbor and says, where's my candelabrum? And the neighbor very solemnly says, I'm really sorry to tell you the terrible news. It passed away. It's no longer among us. Are you crazy? A candelabrum passing away? He says, well, how come you didn't say that when the tray gave birth to a small tray and the spoon, the silver spoon, gave birth to a baby spoon? Only now you're surprised. Well, that was a parable that when a person starts to play around and add things to the Torah, then the next time the person could also subtract. Once you act like it's your Torah, that you could manipulate it whichever way you want, then one day you add, and who's going to complain about that? But the next day, you're going to subtract. That's how the Dubna Maggid explained. So then Maimonides comes along and asks the question. Of course, he lived much before the Dubna Maggid, 800 plus years ago. And he says that how come the rabbis added on so many commandments, so many restrictions, so many enactments? And he said because the rabbis never said that what they're adding on is one of the 613 biblical commandments. They're not adding on. They're telling us there are 613 biblical commandments. And yes, the Torah itself says to the rabbis, I want you to protect them. I want you to preserve them. So what the rabbis do is they put on covers to protect the fabric of the commandments. And they tell you this is a cover. It's not the initial commandment. That is not a problem. There's a famous midrash, Adam and Eve, the first people who have been commanded by God not to eat of a particular fruit, of a particular tree. And what happens is that, of course, she's enticed by the serpent and she eats of the fruit of the tree, and the rest is history. So the midrash explains what happened over here. God tells Adam, don't eat the fruit of that tree. Tell your wife. Give her the message. He gives the message to his wife, but he doesn't trust her. So he says, you know what? God says, don't eat the fruit of the tree. Don't even touch the tree, because the day you will do that, you will die. The serpent was a smart serpent, and the serpent says to Eve, is it true that you're not allowed to eat any of the trees from in the garden? No, just one tree. We were told we can't eat or touch it. No, they were never told they can't touch it. And the snake says, well, what happens if you touch it? Well, we're going to die. So the snake pushed her against the tree, and nothing happened. He says, you see, it's a fairy tale. It's not true. Just, you can eat it. It's not going to harm you. And that's what caused her to eat of the forbidden fruit. From this we derive that don't add on to God's commandment. If Adam would have told Eve, God told me not to eat of the fruit of the tree, I would like to tell you it's better, we should keep away from it, we shouldn't even touch it, lest we be tempted. If he would have done it that way, we wouldn't have been here today. The world would have been a totally different world. So that's one of the lessons about not adding on, not putting your 2 cents into the text and making the text read according to your personal subjective feelings, even if they're very good and well-intentioned. Now we get to the so-called 10 Commandments. The first statement, there are really 10 statements because they're not all commandments. The first statement, which is in chapter 5, verse 6, God says, I am God your God, who has taken you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. This statement, according to Maimonides, is also a commandment, even though it's stated in a declarative form. I am, this is who I am. But this is to teach us that we have to accept the belief in a God. And it raises a question, how could you command someone to believe in something if they already accept that God is the commander, so they already believe in God? If they don't believe in God, how could you say God commands you to believe in him? It doesn't make any sense. That's one of the challenges to considering this to be a commandment. However, the answer given by the Abarbanel and later on clarified and elaborated on in Hasidic literature is that to believe in God is not a commandment. That's something that you have the belief or you don't have the belief. And if you don't have it, you can get it just by using rational thought. It's much more rational to believe that the world was created than the world just came about by itself. So you don't need belief and faith to accept that there's a God. So what are we commanded to believe in? That the God that we already accept and know exists is beyond anything that we could imagine, is beyond anything within the realm of our human way of thinking. So that's the commandment. And the second part of it is, the commandment is not just to believe, but to apply the belief to your understanding, to your intellect. Then, later on, the third commandment is don't bear God's name in vain, which is don't swear, give an oath, not swear as curse, but swear as giving an oath, invoking God's name in vain. What does that mean, in vain? There are 2 different ways of understanding what it means to do something in vain. One is, if a person swears falsely, then obviously you invoke God's name to support a lie. That's one form of it, so you used his name in vain. The second way is that you say the truth, but it's something that is ridiculously obvious that there's no point in swearing. If someone points to a table and he swears by God that that's a table, that would be using God's name in vain. Now the Talmud says that when God declared those words, don't take God's name in vain, the whole earth trembled. Well, what's going on over here? Why was the world more sensitive to that commandment more than the one that preceded it? Don't have any other gods. Isn't that a thing that the world should tremble if people believe in other gods? Or later on when it says observe the Shabbos, The world didn't tremble then? Don't commit murder. That should be an earth-shattering commandment, because murder undermines the whole stability of the world. But the world shook when God's name was taken in vain, when the suggestion that someone could take his name in vain. And one way of understanding that is that there's something unique about this transgression. Every sin that a person commits, it's because the person is either rebelling against God, in the worst case, ignoring God, which is also bad, not caring about God, just thinking about what they're going to benefit from it and just keeping God out of the equation. There's one sin, however, which is even worse, because you're including God in your sin. When a person swears and uses God's name, and even if they don't use God's name, when they just say, I'm swearing, that implies that God is your witness. What you're doing is taking God, dragging him, or to use a more contemporary English word, schlepping him into your vice, into your transgression, making him support what you're doing wrong. It's like taking God into the bank and holding up the bank, using God to do it. That's worse than just going against God, ignoring God, because you're not invoking, you're not bringing him into the sin. In truth, every sin, you're taking God's energy and putting it into your transgression, but it's not overt. In this way, it's overt, so the whole world trembled, because if you're going to sully God to that extent, then God's energy that keeps the world going is undermined. Then we get to the fourth commandment. We're not going to go through all 10. And it's Shomar es Yom HaShabbos. This is verse 12, chapter 5, verse 12. Shomar es Yom HaShabbos. L'kadsho. Keep or guard the day of the Shabbos, to keep it holy. In the book of Exodus, where the 10 commandments appear the first time, and I should have noted that before, that this is the second version of the 10 commandments, because Moses is repeating the things that were told to the Jewish people in the previous 4 books. The book of Deuteronomy is a reiteration of what happened before. There it uses the term zachar, remember the Shabbos, to keep it holy. Here it's keep it or guard it, protect it, preserve it. And the difference is, remembering is positive, doing something. How do we fulfill the mitzvah to remember Shabbos? By reciting the Kiddush, reciting the Havdalah, lighting the Shabbos candles. These are all, eating the meals, these are all extensions of remembering. Although the literal meaning, remembering, is just saying the words, that Shabbos is a day of holiness. That's sufficient biblically. Rabbinically, you're supposed to say it over a cup of wine, and then by extension, anything you do to enhance the spirit of Shabbos, to show appreciation for its holiness, is an extension of that remembrance. Guarding means preserving its integrity by not working on Shabbos, by ceasing and desisting from any kind of work that is forbidden on Shabbos. So which is it? Which did God say? Remember or keep? 2 versions. Are they in conflict with one another? And the Talmud says no. Shamar v'zachar b'dibur echad. They were uttered by God simultaneously. But what does that mean for us? I mean, in the olden days, that was considered to be a miracle, to hear 2 voices at once. Now, you can just put on 2 recordings at once, and you hear two sounds at once. But what it means is that there is no separation between the 2. When you observe the Shabbos by refraining from work, you are remembering it. You are preserving its integrity. The 2 are 2 sides of the same coin. Just like when a person makes Kiddush and eats the Shabbos meal and sings, they feel the spiritually uplifting feeling. Similarly, by not working, it's not intended just to make people restrict what they're doing, but it enables them to plug into the atmosphere of Shabbos. Then it says, it adds in that same verse, Kashet Sivcha Hashem Elokecha, as God commanded you. In the next commandment, honor your father and mother, it also says, that's in verse 16, as God, your God, commanded you. Only these two commandments does it mention that we were commanded to do these previously. Why not the others? The Chassam Sofer, a 19th century sage, says something very interesting. Keeping Shabbos and honoring parents have one thing in common, that there's a very rational basis for it, very natural thing. Shabbos is a day of rest. People who work 6 days a week want to take off at least one day. You can't just keep people working 7 days a week and giving them no rest. In fact, when the Jews were in Egypt and slaves, Moses got Pharaoh to give them a day off, and happened to take Shabbos as the day off, anticipating that that would be the day that they would be commanded to observe later on. And Pharaoh agreed. Why? Because Moses convinced him, you want productive slaves? Give them a day off. They'll work much harder the next day. So there's a simple, logical, rational reason, comfortable, convenient reason for observing Shabbos, because it's a day off from work. Same thing with honoring parents. There's a very rational reason to honor parents, because they support us, they take care of our needs, they educate us, and they give us all the things that they give us. Again, not all parents fit that bill, but it's generally the case that parents deserve honor and respect because of what they do for us, in addition to the fact that they brought us into the world. But in the desert, they didn't need to honor Shabbos or parents because of the rational reason. They didn't need Shabbos. They had Shabbos 7 days a week. They didn't work. 7 days a week they were off. They didn't have to plow. They didn't have to sow. They didn't have to do any work. They didn't have to go to an office and do even clerical work. They were able to just sit leisurely, and according to our Hasidic sages, they were engaged in meditation of thinking about God. So they had Shabbos 7 days a week. So why did they have to keep Shabbos? Because God commanded you. That does not apply to other commandments. But here, the Torah wants to emphasize that even though Shabbos, you don't need the commandment, you can do it rationally, they did it because God commanded them. The same thing with honoring parents. Their parents didn't have to support them. They were supported by God. They had the manna from heaven. Everything was, the clothing grew on them. They didn't have to, their parents didn't have to go shopping for them or do anything for them. And yet, God says, you honor your parents because you were commanded, even when you don't have the rational basis for it. Okay, let's go on to the Shema. That is chapter 6, verse 4. Every Jew knows what the Shema is. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. It's one of the most, it is actually the most important declaration a Jew can make. Jews have said this. They say it every morning, every evening, before they go to bed. Jews say it before they pass on. Jews said it on the way to the gas chambers during the Holocaust. It's the affirmation and the belief in God's unity. There is one God, which has many layers of meaning, which we're not going to go into, except to say that on the simplest level it excludes belief in other gods, and on the most spiritual level it means to exclude anything else but God. God is the source and essence of everything in this universe, and that's what we affirm when we say the Shema. Now, the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, says that all the 10 commandments are hinted in the Shema. Actually, it's not just the Shema that we read in this week's portion. Next week is the second paragraph of the Shema, and there's a third paragraph that we take from the book of Numbers. If you put all those 3 paragraphs together, you'll find references to the 10 commandments. For example, it says in the 10 commandments, don't have any other gods. What corresponds to that in the Shema? God is one. Now, in the Shema, we also have the mitzvah of mezuzah, putting the mezuzah on the doorposts of our homes. What does that correspond to? That corresponds to lo tachmo, the last of the 10 commandments. Don't covet. Don't be jealous or envious of your neighbors, whatever it is that they have, their house, their wife, their whatever possessions they have. So how does that relate to mezuzah? Well, on the surface it means just like the mezuzah is placed on the doorpost of your home that indicates that it's your house, don't covet your neighbor's house. But there's a deeper understanding. When we look at the mezuzah, what does the mezuzah indicate? Mezuzah contains within it the Shema, the declaration of the belief in one God. Oh, we already said that in the morning, in the evening. Why do we have to have it on our homes? Because our homes are an extension of ourselves that represent our property. There are many people who don't own a lot of whatever it is, properties, but they have their own home. The American dream is to have your own house. The home represents that which is your possession. It's not enough to affirm the belief in God in terms of your personal life. It has to affect also your possessions. If your possessions are not guided by the belief in one God, then you're missing something very crucial. What does that do to a person? What that does is that it takes the person's desire for property, for material possessions, to an extent that you will take whatever you can put your hands on. You'll see your neighbor's house, you'll say, I would like that house as well. I want that which belongs to someone else. What curbs your appetite for worldly possessions that you have to control everything? When you realize that this is God's house and God put you in this house, He wants you to recognize that there are boundaries. This is where your house begins and this is where your house ends. What's beyond that is not yours. Now it's interesting that the word mezuzah, it simply means doorpost, but it's the name that we attach to the piece of parchment that is placed in a case and affixed to the doorpost. The word mezuzah has in it two words, zu and zeh, which in English translate as her and him, or she and he. And in the engagement contract at a Jewish wedding, there's an expression over there, is that we will share everything. I will not take what is yours, and you will not take what is mine. We will not hide from each other. And it uses the term lo zu mizeh, lo zeh mizu. He will not take from her, and she will not take from him. When you put the two, zu and zeh, together, that means there's going to be harmony in this house. When is there harmony in the house? When you recognize that God is in charge of not only your life, He's in charge of your property and your possessions as well. And that's reflected in the Shema when it says you shall love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your, we translate might, but the Talmud says that refers to your money, your property. That you recognize that your property is also divine, also has a need to show recognition that God is the one who provides you with everything. And once you look at property as a God-given gift, and there's a reason why He gave you that gift, to use it in the right way, it'll do two things. Number one, it'll inspire you to use it for good things. And number two, it'll take away the desire to acquire property and possessions that are not yours and not intended for you. One of the commandments, backtrack a little bit, is don't commit theft, lo tignov. Now we usually translate it as theft. The Talmud says it refers to kidnapping, because in the context it's between the laws of murder and adultery, which are capital crimes. So therefore, this theft is also a capital crime, and that is the crime of kidnapping. However, there is also a rabbinic tradition that it includes and incorporates all forms of theft. Well, they once quoted a teaching from the Kotzker. Kotsk was a town in Poland, and the Rebbe of Kotsk was known for his sharpness and his obsession with truth and with depth. And once one of his followers came back to his home, and they asked him, "What did you learn there in Kotsk that you didn't have already?" Well, how do you translate the commandment, "Don't steal"? He said, "Don't steal money from whom? From someone else." He said, "No, in Kotsk we learned, don't steal from yourself." What does that mean? Don't steal from yourself. Don't take money out of your wallet and put it in another pocket. No, it means don't deceive yourself. Because theft, the Talmud also says, can be understood to mean deceiving someone. If you deceive someone in business, that's also a form of theft. When you deceive someone about your intentions, it's also a form of theft. For example, you invite someone to your home and you really have no intention of them coming, and the only reason you invited them is because you know they're going to say no. You're convinced they're going to say no. So you're inviting them only because you want to show off that you're a very hospitable person. That's called stealing. You're stealing the person's mind. Well, just like you can't steal someone else's mind, you can't deceive someone, you can't deceive yourself. As one Hasidic Rebbe, the Rebbe Maharash as he was called, once said, "Who do you think you're fooling? Could you fool God? Obviously not. Could you fool other people? They'll catch on, they'll realize it. But there's one person you could fool. That's yourself. Is it a trick to fool a fool? So there's no point in fooling yourself, and what we call fooling ourselves, others will call being delusional. And delusional doesn't only mean, as the famous Rabbi Dr. Twersky says, that if a person puts his arm inside his shirt and he says, "I'm Napoleon," we take him off to the institution, to the mental institution. If a person claims that he's some biblical figure or the Messiah, he's considered to be not normal because he's delusional. Well, why is it that when people put themselves down and say, "I'm a nobody, I'm an idiot, I'm dumb, and I'm incapable of doing anything, or I'm incapable of meeting the challenges," all of a sudden they're considered to be normal people? No, they're just as delusional. Yet we don't put them away because we have an obsession with deceiving ourselves. And that's what the commandment is. Don't steal even from yourself. One final thought. There's another commandment, a very fundamental one. As Hashem Elokecha tira, God, your God, you shall fear. That's in chapter 6, verse 13. God, your God, you shall fear. Now, in Hebrew, there's a word here, es. Es doesn't really have a translation. If you take the word out, it'll mean the same thing. But the Talmud does give a meaning to the word es. The Talmud says that the word es means something that is subordinate or auxiliary. For example, if you have a primary object and then you attach something to it, that auxiliary part would be considered es. Like, for example, when it says in the first verse of the Torah, Bereshis, in the beginning, Bara Elokim, God created es hashamayim, the heavens, ve'es ha'aretz, and the earth. Rashi says that the word es means not only did God create heaven and earth, but everything with it. Whatever is in the earth was already there in a certain potential state on the first day of creation. So es means with. Now there was a certain Talmudic sage, his name was Shimon Hoamsoni, and he was a brilliant scholar, and he was able to interpret every single occurrence of the word es in the whole Torah up until this point. Every place he was able to show that the Torah is referring to a primary thing and a secondary thing, an auxiliary thing, a subordinate thing. When he came to this verse, he got stuck. He says, You're supposed to fear God and supposed to fear something else with God? What else? What else can you fear other than God? And he said, you know what? My whole system is obviously wrong. And he rejected all of what he taught until then, because if it was wrong here, it must be wrong all over. And he said, just like God will reward me for interpreting the Torah and putting all this effort in it, God will reward me for abandoning it. You know, sometimes you write something and then you read it again and you cross it out. That's the sign that you're writing. The more you cross out, the better it is. Once two great scholars, both prolific authors, one of them had his works very well accepted, and the other one, very few people were interested in his works, even though they were brilliant. And they once met, and he says to his colleague, how come everyone reads your works, and they're quoted, and mine no one really gets excited about it? So he said to him, well, tell me how you do your writing? He says, well, I get up early in the morning, the mind is fresh, and that's when I write. He says, no, I do it differently. I write at night, and then I wake up early in the morning and I cross everything out. That's how my books are more accepted than yours, because you come up with brilliant ideas in the morning, but your mind isn't as clear when you edit it, so you just let everything through. By me, there's a filter, and that's what makes it more acceptable. So Shimon Hamsoni said, I will get credit for editing out all of what I've taught, because you can't add anything when you're talking about fearing God. Rabbi Akiva comes along and says, no, there's nothing wrong. You can interpret this verse as well. Who do you fear with God? Torah scholars. People who devote their lives to the study of Torah become so attached to God that the respect you have for them is in fact respect for God. There's nothing wrong with attributing respect to these people because of their association with God, and therefore continue to interpret the word es. There's no problem with it. Rabbi Akiva saved the day for this scholar. So this is more or less a few tidbits on this week's Parsha. There's so much more here, but we'll have to be content with what we did until now. And God willing, next week we'll continue with the Parshas Eikev. This is, as I said before, Shabbos Nachamu, double consolation. That means that we will be consoled for both temples, but there's only going to be one temple. But that one temple will contain within it the greatest elements of the first two temples. As the Rebbe explains, the first temple was more godly, more energy, but people were less receptive because they were not the ones who created it. The second temple was not as godly, but it was much more within the reach of people. The third temple will be the most godly, and it'll be accessible to everyone. So we'll have a double consolation. May we see the rebuilding of the third temple imminently. Meanwhile, have a good evening and a good Shabbos.